The hills that would one day cradle Highclere Castle did not begin as a place of grandeur. For centuries they were simply quiet stretches of chalk downland, open to the wind and shaped by the slow pulse of the seasons. Yet even in that early stillness, something about this land felt unusually charged, as if the ground itself held a memory far older than any future mansion. Long before a single stone was laid, long before the idea of a castle existed, the land carried a subtle pull, the kind that drew people toward it long before they had a name for why. The earliest written trace appears in the year 749, a time when England itself was only a collection of kingdoms and tribal boundaries. An Anglo-Saxon king granted this land to the bishops of Winchester, a sign that the place already held value. Kings did not give away ordinary fields. They offered places that conveyed influence, security, and advantage. The entry looks simple on parchment, but it marks the moment these hills stepped into recorded history. It suggests that even in the 8th century, this site was not just landscape. It was a resource, a foothold in a region shaped by politics, faith, and power. Still, the written record tells only part of the story. The land's older history lingers in the soil itself. Long before the Anglo-Saxons, before the Romans, before any formal estate existed, people moved across these hills. Archaeologists believe ancient trackways once crossed the slopes, lines worn into the earth by repeated footsteps of traders, herders, and travelers who read the land the way we read maps. The chalk beneath the grass carried flint used by early communities, and the scattered mounds that still dot the region hint at rituals and burials belonging to an era when the world was a vast mystery and the sky was the only cathedral. The Domesday Book of 1086 recorded this land again, confirming its continuing importance as Norman rulers tightened their hold on England. That listing transformed the estate from a quiet entry in a church ledger into one of the officially recognized assets of the new regime. By then, fields were cultivated, woodlands managed, and the area had become part of a structured, taxed, and closely monitored England. But even in that structured world, Highclere's early landscape remained a mixture of wild forest and open downs, a place where nature still commanded respect, and where human presence felt temporary compared to the age of the land itself. What makes this beginning so compelling is not the buildings that stood here, but the ones that had not yet emerged. The site was nothing more than land, yet it already held the outlines of destiny. It was a place where the powerful passed through, where bishops sought refuge, where kings found lodging, and where the influence of the church rooted itself deeply. Those early centuries acted like a quiet overture, setting the foundation for the enormous drama that would follow. The hills themselves shaped the future. Their vantage points offered wide views of the valleys, the forests, and the distant horizon. The terrain created a natural sense of boundary and enclosure, a subtle suggestion of where something larger might someday rise. Even the climate, damp mornings, rolling mists, the way sunlight pooled in the low spots, added an atmosphere that would later make Highclere Castle look as though it had grown out of the land rather than been imposed upon it. As generations passed, the estate remained steady while the world around it shifted. Kingdoms dissolved, rulers changed, wars came and went, but Highclere stayed anchored in place, absorbing each era like layers of paint on a canvas. The people who lived nearby likely could not imagine that their familiar hills would one day be crowned with towers recognized across the world. But history often moves that way, quietly at first, slowly gathering momentum until a place once known only to shepherds and monks becomes the beating heart of a much larger story. Highclere's early identity was shaped by forces far older than the families who would later inhabit it. It was shaped by the land itself, the steady rise of chalk hills, the fertile soil, the streams threading through the valleys, and the ancient paths carved long before written language reached the region. All of this created a foundation that made the estate more than real estate. It became a stage waiting for its actors, a plot waiting for its architecture, a place that held patience as centuries passed. This is where the story of Highclere truly begins, not with grandeur, not with aristocracy, and not with the famous silhouette of the castle. It begins with land that quietly gathered meaning, century after century, until eventually someone would look at these hills and decide they were worthy of a house that could match their quiet, enduring gravity. By the late Middle Ages, the quiet hills of Highclere had transformed into something far more defined, no longer just land on a map, but a strategic and symbolic estate woven deeply into the power structures of the church. The bishops of Winchester, among the most influential figures in medieval England, saw potential here long before the rise of grand country houses. They chose this place not for decoration or leisure, but for authority, for the stability it offered, the security of its high ground, and the subtle advantage of being both secluded and connected to important routes. What had once been open downs began to evolve into a domain that served both spiritual and political functions. Sometime in the late 14th century, Bishop William of Wykeham transformed this landscape by constructing a grand medieval residence at Highclere. This was not a simple manor, nor a modest ecclesiastical retreat. It was a palace in the full medieval sense, fortified yet elegant, surrounded by gardens and carefully arranged grounds that reflected both the bishop's influence and the church's wealth. Medieval bishops were not just religious leaders, they were statesmen, landowners, and political power brokers. Their residences needed to communicate stability and command respect. Highclere fulfilled that role with ease, rising above the surrounding countryside like a quiet statement of authority. The palace sat within its own park, enclosed and ordered in a way that would have felt impressive to visitors accustomed to smaller rural estates. Its gardens, unusually expansive for the period, served both symbolic and practical purposes. They provided food, herbs, and controlled greenery, but they also projected refinement and control over nature, an outward sign of a bishop's status. Landscaping at that time was not the aesthetic pursuit it would later become. It was a demonstration of resources, labor, and prestige. The very act of shaping the land announced to all who approached that the estate belonged to someone whose decisions mattered beyond the parish. Kings understood this too. Highclere appeared on the itinerary of monarchs, including Edward II, whose visit in the early 1300s underscores the estate's reputation long before the grandeur of its later architecture. A royal visit required security, space, and provisions on a scale that only the most capable estates could offer. That the kings of England chose to stay here, even briefly, confirms that Highclere was already notable, already trusted, already woven into the fabric of national movement and influence. These visits added an unspoken layer of importance. The estate was not merely a religious retreat, but a place where the secular and sacred met in subtle negotiations. The medieval palace itself has long since vanished, worn away by centuries of rebuilding, repurposing, and reinvention. Yet its architectural spirit lingers in the DNA of the estate. The way the grounds expand outward, the way certain sightlines draw the eye, the placement of the core buildings. All of these echo a layout first imposed by bishops who understood the land and the message they wanted it to send. Even the decision to build here at all set the trajectory for everything that followed. Highclere became a site where architecture would always strive for significance, never settling for mediocrity, never content to be just another country residence. Although no stones from the medieval palace remain standing, its ghost persists in the estate's logic. The bishop's choice established Highclere as a place of authority, a place worthy of visits from monarchs, and a place where spiritual power left marks deeper than foundation trenches. They set an architectural precedent. The belief that this land deserved grandeur, that belief would survive into the next centuries, shaping every remodel, every expansion, and every attempt to elevate the estate into something that matched its silent, centuries-old gravity. Thus, before Highclere Castle was a castle, before its towers pierced the skyline and its facade became recognizable across the world, it was already a seat of influence. Its medieval chapter left behind more than ruins. It carved into the landscape a sense of purpose, an expectation of significance that future owners would feel compelled to honor, expand, and immortalize. The fall of the medieval palace at Highclere began not with fire, decay, or neglect, but with a political earthquake that swept across England and reshaped the very meaning of power. The Reformation, which fractured centuries of church authority almost overnight, turned sacred lands into contested prizes and dragged estates like Highclere into the turbulence of national transformation. What had once been a stable seat of the bishops of Winchester suddenly became a liability. A symbol of a world the crown was determined to dismantle and repurpose. When King Edward VI confiscated the estate in the mid-16th century, Highclere was not singled out. It was simply one property in a massive transfer of power from church to state. Yet for this land, the impact was profound. The bishop's medieval palace, once protected by ecclesiastical privilege, now found itself vulnerable to the shifting priorities of monarchs, courtiers, and new political alliances. Buildings that had stood for dignity and ceremony lost their purpose almost instantly. The gardens the bishops had curated no longer had a keeper. The halls that had echoed with clerical authority began to empty. Without the church's protection, the estate entered an era defined by uncertainty. In the years that followed, Highclere passed through several hands. Families granted favor, then losing it. Owners who saw the estate as an asset to extract value from, rather than a legacy to steward. Under this unstable chain of possession, the old palace gradually declined. Roofs leaked, walls shifted, structures aged without proper care, and the grandeur once imposed by the bishops faded as the political fervor of the Reformation rippled through the countryside. The rise of Protestant England did not make room for medieval Catholic architecture. It had no interest in preserving symbols of the old order. Highclere, though not destroyed by force, was allowed to erode through neglect. But decline often creates space for transformation. And the Reformation's chaos ultimately gave Highclere its greatest opportunity. In 1679, during the restoration of the monarchy and the rebuilding of English society after decades of turmoil, Sir Robert Sawyer purchased the estate. His arrival marked the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. Sawyer saw the property not as a worn remnant of ecclesiastical authority, but as a foundation for a future lineage. He tore down what remained of the medieval palace and rebuilt the heart of the estate as placehouse, a new home suited for the ambitions of a rising political figure. This reconstruction did not simply update the estate, it rewired its purpose. The medieval identity tied to bishops, rituals, and ecclesiastical power dissolved, replaced by the emerging vision of an English country seat grounded in heritage, governance, and aristocratic ascent. The very act of demolishing the old palace symbolized a clean break from the centuries that had shaped the land's early meaning. Highclere was no longer a religious stronghold. It was becoming a secular estate, one capable of adapting to the rapidly modernizing world. The political tremors of the 16th century had erased the first incarnation of Highclere, but in doing so, they cleared the ground for everything that would follow. The estate had been dismantled and disoriented, yet in that loss lay freedom. When Sawyer arrived, he inherited land stripped of its medieval identity, ready for reinvention. The old house had vanished once already. Now the estate stood at the threshold of rebirth, waiting for the family that would ultimately shape its destiny for centuries to come. The Reformation had not just changed England, it had changed Highclere. It disrupted the past so thoroughly that the estate had no choice but to reinvent itself. And from that upheaval emerged the opportunity for Highclere to become not merely a residence, but a legacy. When Robert Sawyer arrived at Highclere in 1679, he did not step into a grand estate or an architectural marvel. He stepped into the remains of a broken past. A landscape stripped of its medieval dignity, its former palace weakened by neglect, and its identity hanging somewhere between memory and possibility. The chaos of the Reformation had cleared the stage, and Sawyer, a man deeply embedded in the legal and political fabric of Restoration England, recognized an opportunity that others had overlooked. Highclere did not intimidate him, it intrigued him. Sawyer was Attorney General to Charles II and James II, a skilled politician, and a figure who moved comfortably among those shaping the future of the kingdom. He needed an estate that reflected his rising stature, a place not just to inhabit, but to anchor a legacy. Highclere's history, its ties to bishops, kings, and centuries of influence, offered a foundation rich enough for ambition. But the estate he acquired was, in truth, only a shadow of its former self. The old bishop's palace had decayed. The grounds had lost their order. The medieval earthworks and garden outlines lingered like faint echoes of another world. Highclere was ready for reinvention, and Sawyer intended to use it as the starting point for a dynasty. He demolished what remained of the medieval residence and constructed Place House, a new structure designed for a new era. It was not yet the awe-inspiring silhouette we associate with Highclere Castle, but it was the first true expression of the estate's future character. Place House marked the shift from ecclesiastical retreat to aristocratic seat. It introduced symmetry, proportion, and a sense of order that reflected Sawyer's legal mind and political disposition. The estate began to feel intentional again, structured, cultivated, and dignified. Place House became more than Sawyer's home. It became the physical embodiment of a legacy he hoped would extend beyond his lifetime. In 1692, he passed it to his only daughter, Margaret, who married Thomas Herbert, the 8th Earl of Pembroke. With that marriage, the estate entered the orbit of one of England's most distinguished families, bringing with it a new dimension of cultural and political life. The Herberts did not simply inherit a house, they inherited a foundation waiting to be built upon. Their son, Robert Sawyer Herbert, shaped Highclere in ways that would echo for centuries. He expanded the gardens, planted new groves, commissioned decorative temples, and began assembling the portrait collection that would later become a defining element of the estate's identity. These additions were not mere ornaments. They signaled the emergence of Highclere as a seat of taste, culture, and intellectual ambition. The estate was slowly evolving into a place where architecture and landscape spoke a language of refinement and continuity. Sawyer's decision to rebuild rather than repair had set a precedent. Highclere would never be content with what it had been. Each generation would feel compelled to elevate it. Under the Herberts, the estate began to shed its transitional identity and adopt a new one, an aristocratic home rooted in heritage but oriented toward artistic and architectural expansion. For the first time, Highclere carried the quiet confidence of a family estate with long horizons. Henry Herbert, a later heir, deepened that trajectory when he became Baron Porchester and eventually the first Earl of Carnarvon under King George III. His elevation formally linked Highclere with the title that would define it for centuries, the Carnarvon Legacy. The estate was no longer just a home. It was the seat of a lineage that would influence British politics, culture, and eventually global history. During this period, the gardens gained the first hints of the landscapes that would later become iconic. Small temples appeared among the trees, designed as places for reflection, conversation, and the subtle display of classical learning. Portraits began to line the walls, turning Place House into a gallery that narrated family history alongside national history. Highclere was becoming a living canvas, part architecture, part ancestry, part aspiration. Yet even with these refinements, Place House still felt like a prologue, a carefully constructed overture to something greater. The estate held potential beyond its current scale, waiting for an architect bold enough to transform it into the masterpiece suggested by its setting and history. The Herberts sensed it, even if they could not yet see its full shape. Place House was not the final form of Highclere, but it was the moment the estate redefined itself. It anchored the Carnarvon family, gathered the first elements of art and beauty that would later fill the castle, and established the rhythm of constant reinvention that still echoes through its corridors today. Before towers and turrets dominated the skyline, before the Victorian age left its imprint, Highclere was reborn as a home built for legacy, and that legacy was only beginning to unfold. By the early 18th century, Highclere was no longer just a house on a hill. It was becoming something far larger and far more unusual, an estate where the land itself was being shaped with ambition equal to any architectural dream. Place House had given the Carnarvon family a foothold, but it was the transformation of the grounds that elevated Highclere from a promising estate into a landscape of wonder. What began as a collection of fields and remnants of ecclesiastical gardens evolved into a living masterpiece shaped by exotic plants, bold experimentation, and an emerging philosophy of beauty that would come to define the English countryside. The shift began quietly with a family whose name rarely appears in popular retellings of Highclere's story, but whose influence can still be felt in the estate's oldest trees, the Pococks. Connected through marriage to the Mills family, who once served as rectors on the estate, the Pococks were scholars, travelers, and early botanists. Their curiosity stretched far beyond the Hampshire hills. Reverend Richard Pocock, the Orientalist and prolific travel writer, ventured across the Middle East in the 1730s, documenting cultures, landscapes, and, significantly, plant life unfamiliar to England. During his journey through Lebanon, he collected seeds of a species that would change the face of English estates, the cedar of Lebanon. These seeds, brought back across continents, germinated at Highclere. They grew slowly at first, adjusting to unfamiliar soil and climate, but those that took root began to flourish. Their branches spread horizontally in wide, layered tiers, an unmistakable silhouette that would later become one of the estate's signature features. These cedars were not ordinary additions to a garden. They were living symbols of sophistication, knowledge, and global curiosity. At a time when the English elite competed not only in wealth, but in worldliness, possessing rare botanical specimens was a mark of distinction, and Highclere had become one of the earliest estates to successfully nurture these remarkable trees. As more seeds found their way into the soil, some through the pococs, others through parallel botanical networks of the era, the estate's landscape began to reflect a new aesthetic forming across Britain. The 18th century was an age obsessed with nature, but not the wild, unshaped kind. Landowners wanted scenery that looked effortless, yet was subtly orchestrated, serpentine pathways that hinted at mystery, rolling lawns that framed distant hills, groves positioned to catch light at the perfect angle. Highclere was fertile ground for such ideas. Under the hands of the Herbert and Carnarvon families, the estate expanded its green tapestry with deliberate intention. Walkways curved gently instead of cutting straight lines across the fields. New plantings created pockets of shade and light that shifted with the seasons. Wooded areas were shaped into natural amphitheaters, their trees guiding visitors' eyes toward carefully chosen vistas. Cedars stood like ancient sentinels, their deep green crowns breaking the horizon in dramatic contrast to the chalky downs beyond. Travelers who visited Highclere during this period often described the grounds with a kind of reverence. They wrote of wandering through alleys that seemed to appear and vanish like threads of a dream. They marveled at trees unlike any native to England, watching the cedars rise year after year into towering figures that evoked the landscapes of distant civilizations. The estate became known not only for its lineage and architecture, but for the feeling it evoked, a sense of stepping into a curated world where nature was encouraged to be more beautiful than it had ever been on its own. Highclere's evolution into one of the most admired parks in England did not happen in a single decade. It grew gradually, nurtured by curiosity, shaped by taste, and sustained by generations who understood that a great house deserved a great setting. Each new planting, each reshaping of land, each experiment with species unfamiliar to British soil added a layer of richness to the estate's identity. The landscape was no longer an adornment, it was a force in itself, a quiet spectacle that amplified the home it surrounded. By the end of the century, Highclere's grounds had become a precursor to the sweeping visions that would soon arrive with Capability Brown. But even before his influence, the estate was already known for its rare trees, its elegantly arranged views, and its atmosphere of cultivated wonder. The cedars stood as proof that the estate could carry the weight of global discovery on its branches, and that the land, once merely a backdrop, had become the soul of Highclere's beauty. The park that emerged during this era was not merely a garden, it was the first sign that Highclere would one day command the attention of the world. By the dawn of the 18th century's close, Highclere felt like a house caught between eras, rooted in the legacy of Place House, yet increasingly out of step with the ambitions of the family who lived within its walls. The estate had grown in elegance, the parkland had matured into something remarkable. The family name had risen in influence, but the house itself struggled to keep pace. It carried the weight of centuries, yet lacked the architectural authority needed to match the scale of its land, its lineage, or its aspirations. Highclere was becoming a place that felt too small for its own destiny. The Herberts and the early Carnarvons sensed this shift long before any architect put quill to paper. Visitors saw a home of refinement, but the family saw its limitations. Corridors that seemed narrow compared to the grand avenues outside, rooms that lacked the dramatic proportions seen in other great houses of the era, and a facade that whispered history when fashion demanded something that spoke in bold, convincing tones. The world of architecture was changing rapidly, and with it came new ideas that tempted the estate toward reinvention. Before Highclere could become the iconic silhouette recognized around the world, several ambitious attempts at its transformation came and went. each one revealing just how restless the family had become. One of the earliest proposals flirted with the Greek revival style that had swept Britain like a fever. It promised grandeur through purity, clean marble lines, classical columns, and the kind of symmetry that carried echoes of ancient temples. But while the drawings looked elegant on parchment, they felt wrong for the land. Highclere's rolling hills, towering cedars, and medieval echoes resisted the austerity of Greek geometry. The style could impress, but it could not belong. The estate demanded something with more narrative weight, something that could speak to its long, layered history, rather than replace it with a foreign ideal. Another proposal embraced a more classical English form, balanced, restrained, and dignified. But this too failed to satisfy. It felt competent, but not extraordinary, polished, but not visionary. The family wanted a house that could command attention the way their parkland did, a house that could rise boldly above its surroundings instead of blending politely into them. The more they studied these designs, the clearer it became that conventional beauty was not enough. Even the architects struggled to articulate what Highclere needed. The estate was too ancient, too storied, too atmospheric for styles that relied solely on symmetry and restraint. A classical mansion could stand anywhere. Highclere needed a home that could stand only here. Each rejected design deepened the realization that the estate was outgrowing its current skin. The old placehouse seemed increasingly fragile beside the expanding park, overshadowed by the cedars of Lebanon, and dwarfed by the ambitions of a family whose influence was rising steadily through British society. The problem was not simply aesthetic, it was emotional. Highclere had evolved into a landscape of drama and significance, and its house needed to evolve with it. The estate felt like a stage awaiting a theater worthy of its scenes. Its pathways framed grand vistas, its lawns hinted at sweeping narratives, and its groves held a quiet magnificence that the existing house could no longer match. Every year the contrast grew sharper. The land felt vast, poetic, almost theatrical, while the house remained comparatively modest, a remnant of an earlier chapter rather than the beginning of a new one. The Carnarvons, by this point deeply woven into political and aristocratic circles, understood the symbolic power of architecture. They needed a residence that reflected their status, their taste, and the estate's rising significance. They needed a home that could greet kings, dignitaries, scholars, scientists, artists, a building capable of hosting the world, not simply sheltering a family. Highclere was ready to step into a larger story. It only needed the right visionary to guide it. These failed attempts were not wasted. They clarified the estate's identity. Highclere did not want to be Greek. It did not want to be purely classical. It did not want a modest facelift or a polite expansion. It wanted transformation, bold, theatrical, rooted in history, yet reaching toward the future. It wanted a voice loud enough to match the land's natural grandeur, and in the early 19th century, that voice finally arrived. But before he could raise towers that would redefine the English skyline, Charles Barry would need to strip away the last remnants of the old house and build something entirely new, something Highclere had been waiting for since the first seeds of its cedars took root. When Charles Barry first arrived at Highclere, the estate stood at a crossroads. The land was magnificent, its trees mature and commanding, its rolling views already shaped into sweeping, painterly scenes. But at its center stood a house that no longer matched the world around it. The Carnarvon family didn't simply want improvement, they wanted transcendence. And Barry, already deep into the monumental work of rebuilding the Palace of Westminster, was one of the few architects in England capable of imagining such transformation. Barry's reputation preceded him. He was known not only for technical mastery, but for something rarer, the ability to merge historical memory with modern ambition. At Westminster, he had taken a shell of a ruined Gothic structure and envisioned a national symbol. Highclere demanded a similar kind of thinking. The family needed someone who could interpret the estate's long history and give it a form bold enough to eclipse every earlier chapter of its existence. When Barry walked the grounds, he understood instantly what the earlier architects had missed. Highclere was not a blank canvas. It was layered with centuries of identity. The bishop's palace, long vanished, had left its ghost in the way the land naturally framed central spaces. Placehouse, with its classical proportions, represented stability, but not grandeur. The cedars, towering like ancient guardians, lent the estate a sense of mythic age. The park carried Capability Brown's early imprint, though it still awaited refinement. All of these elements whispered the same truth. The house needed to be more than an elegant residence. It needed to be a stage. Barry began sketching almost immediately. His first proposals were wide-ranging, more explorations than conclusions. One leaned heavily into the Italianate style he had studied during his travels, a style he admired, one that offered harmony and sophistication. Another returned to a Renaissance vision more aligned with his early training. But neither felt right. Each time he lifted his pen, the land seemed to push back, insisting that Highclere was not meant to imitate Tuscany or Florence. The estate demanded something rooted in England's own architectural lineage. So he turned instead toward the great English houses of the late Tudor and early Jacobean periods, whose forms had once competed with the encroaching Renaissance. This style, sometimes dismissed as too ornate, too theatrical, carried the character and romanticism that Highclere's setting seemed to crave. It blended vertical drama with intricate detail, symmetry with exuberance. It could hold its own against the landscape rather than be swallowed by it. And so, Barry found the answer the estate had been waiting for. A revival of Tudor Jacobean architecture refined with Victorian precision. He presented this emerging vision to the Carnarvon family, and it immediately ignited both excitement and debate. The concept was unlike anything they had expected. Tall towers rising above the treetops, a central facade punctuated with stone tracery and vertical lines that would draw the eye upward, chimneys multiplied and sculpted into decorative silhouettes against the sky, windows arranged in rhythmic patterns, framed in deep stone. It was bold, theatrical, unapologetically English, a design that acknowledged the estate's ancient roots while propelling it into the modern age. But such ambition rarely unfolds without conflict. Some members of the family favored a more restrained design, something aligned with the classical tradition already present in Place House. Others feared that Barry's towering vision would overwhelm the landscape rather than complement it. Critics argued that the elaborate stonework was extravagant, that the height of the central tower was unnecessary, that the Tudor revival was too fantastical to feel authentic. Barry listened to every objection, but he did not bend. His confidence came not from arrogance, but from an intuitive understanding of Highclere's latent grandeur. He was designing not a house, but a landmark. The Carnarvons, after weeks of debate, chose to trust him, and so demolition began. The old Place House, the very structure that had carried the estate through centuries of change, was gradually dismantled. Rooms that had hosted generations vanished behind scaffolding. Foundations were broken open. The familiar contours of the estate disappeared beneath stacks of stone and the rhythmic clatter of construction. To many who witnessed it, the process must have felt like destruction, but Barry saw only the opening act of rebirth. With the old walls cleared, he began shaping the future. The design that emerged, later celebrated as Jacobean, was a bold hybrid of Tudor drama and Jacobean ornamentation, sharpened by Victorian engineering. It was a style that embraced history and invention simultaneously, a language of architecture that allowed Highclere to appear ancient and modern in the same breath. The high central tower would dominate the skyline, a beacon visible for miles. The facade would be rich with carved stone, parapets, pinnacles, and vertical emphasis. Every window, every chimney, every finial was part of a larger narrative. Highclere had found its voice. But this was only the beginning. The land had been waiting for centuries, and now the architect capable of answering its call had arrived. As the foundations of the new house took shape, it was clear that Highclere was no longer evolving slowly. It was stepping into greatness with breathtaking speed. The transformation of Highclere from a refined country house into a monumental stone giant began in 1842, when the first teams of laborers arrived and the familiar silhouette of Place House disappeared beneath scaffolding and rubble. What unfolded over the next 7 years was not just construction. It was a complete remaking of the estate's identity, a rewriting of its architectural language, and a physical manifestation of the Carnarvon's ambition. The project consumed money, labor, and time on a scale that few outside the estate could truly comprehend. Highclere was no longer simply growing. It was undergoing metamorphosis. Stone became the vocabulary of this new vision. The pale bath stone chosen for the facade arrived in endless shipments, hauled by carts across rough terrain, and stacked in massive blocks that caught the changing light in subtle shades of cream and gold. Thousands of tons of it were carved, shaped, and fit together with a precision that seemed both engineering and artistry. The workers, hundreds of them, became the invisible engine of the transformation, chiseling battlements, raising towers, and lifting heavy slabs into place with wooden cranes and sheer brute force. Their days began before dawn and ended long after the sun slipped behind the downs, and each blow of the hammer pushed Highclere closer to the form Charles Barry had envisioned. The central tower rose first, climbing layer by layer until it became a landmark visible miles beyond the estate boundaries. This single structure demanded an orchestration of labor that bordered on the impossible, scaffolding stretching upward like a skeletal forest, teams maneuvering stone at precarious heights, masons working with disciplined rhythm even as winds from the hills threatened their balance. The tower was not merely decorative, it was the statement piece, the declaration that Highclere would stand among the great houses of England with a confidence that bordered on defiant. All around it, the facades grew upward, their surface carved with tracery, finials, and patterned stonework that pushed Victorian craftsmanship to its limits. Every detail, from the slender chimneys that pierced the skyline to the mullioned windows arranged in strict vertical lines, required relentless attention. The estate's grounds, once quiet, became a constant thrum of voices, tools, hooves, and wagons transporting materials. For 7 years, Highclere lived in a cloud of dust, noise, and motion. With such scale came setbacks. Weather halted work for weeks at a time, undoing progress as rain loosened stone and wind damaged incomplete sections. Accidents occurred, inevitable on a site of this size, falls from scaffolding, injuries from lifting heavy blocks, moments when the sheer weight of the stone threatened to overwhelm the structures meant to support it. Each setback slowed the pace, tested the workers, and strained the patience of the Carnarvon family who watched their dream rise with equal parts pride and anxiety. And yet, despite the ambition and the immense resources pouring into the project, not everything could be completed at once. Barry's design was vast, too vast for the time frame, too vast for even the considerable finances behind it. As the exterior walls of the north, east, and south fronts neared completion, it became clear that the interior and west wing lagged behind. Money was spent faster than anticipated, skilled labor grew thin, deadlines slipped. Portions of the house remained incomplete, corridors ending in blank walls, staircases leading to spaces that did not yet exist, scaffolding lingering longer than anyone wished to admit. Tension began to grow within the estate. Some family members questioned Barry's timeline, wondering whether the design had outstripped practicality. Others argued that a masterpiece required patience, that the delays were merely the cost of creating something destined to outlive them all. Meanwhile, the workers themselves faced pressure to accelerate progress. Decisions had to be made quickly, and corners could not be cut. A structure of this scale would collapse under the slightest miscalculation. Every stone placed incorrectly meant hours lost. Every hesitation meant days without progress. As the project pushed toward its final years, tragedy struck again with the passing of the third Earl in 1849, just as the exterior stood largely completed. His departure left a symbolic shadow over the estate. He would never live to see the home he had dreamed into motion. For a moment, the future of the work hung in uncertainty. But the vision was too advanced, too foundational to abandon. The responsibility fell to the next generation, and to Barry's team, to push the project across the threshold from construction into legacy. By the end of the decade, the colossal stone shell of Highclere Castle stood fully formed, its towers dominating the horizon, its facades gleaming with fresh stonework, its silhouette unmistakable even miles away. Though the interior would take years more to perfect, the era of transformation had been sealed. A home once modest in scale had become a landmark. A place once defined by quiet history had become a symbol of Victorian confidence. Highclere had risen, not simply as a home, but as a stone giant carved through 7 years of human effort, ambition, conflict, and unwavering determination. When the exterior of Highclere finally rose in its full Jacobean splendor, it created expectations that were almost impossible to meet. A house with towers piercing the sky and facades carved like a cathedral needed interiors capable of matching that power. And inside, Barry and the Carnarvon family set out to create not just rooms, but experiences, spaces that would astonish visitors the moment they crossed the threshold, environments designed to broadcast status, intellect, and refinement in every direction the eye could travel. If the exterior made a declaration, the interior was meant to prove it. Stepping through the great doors, guests entered a world crafted with Victorian confidence. The first breath inside Highclere carried the faint scent of polished wood, old books, and warmth rising from deep stone fireplaces. Light filtered down from towering windows and traced soft patterns across the floor. Every surface, walls, ceilings, columns, arches, seemed alive with detail. Nothing about the interior was accidental. Everything was meant to impress. The saloon, positioned at the heart of the house, became the defining symbol of Victorian opulence. Its soaring height created a sense of vertical drama, equal to any cathedral, with balconies encircling the space and allowing guests to look down from above as if from private theater boxes. Barry's team carved the woodwork with obsessive care, turning each panel into a tapestry of patterns, floral motifs, heraldic symbols, geometric precision, all stained in deep tones that glowed under gaslight. Above, the ceiling rose into a mock hammer beam roof, a Gothic flourish meant to evoke the great halls of medieval England, while still embracing the Victorian love of spectacle. Conversation echoed in the space with a reverberation that made even whispers sound significant. Beyond the saloon lay the library, a chamber that revealed the intellectual ambitions of the Carnarvon family. More than 5,000 books lined the shelves, volumes on politics, history, science, archaeology, exploration, each carefully arranged so the room felt like a living archive of the world's ideas. The scent of old leather mixed with the warm glow of polished mahogany and the intricate carvings on the bookcases created a rhythm that led the eye deeper into the collection. Antique furniture invited long hours of reading and quiet reflection, while hidden corners allowed privacy for conversations too delicate for drawing room ears. The library was not merely a room, it was the estate's mind. The drawing room, by contrast, displayed its heart. Soft fabrics and pale hues brightened the space, gilded furniture frames caught the afternoon sun, and delicate decorations reflected the refined taste of Victorian aristocracy. Here, guests gathered for conversation, music, and the rituals of polite society. The atmosphere was gentle but not simple. Beneath the elegance lay layers of intention. Every vase, every portrait, every piece of porcelain hinted at the family's connections, education, and travels. Nothing was ostentatious, yet everything signaled refinement. Throughout the house, Barry's team installed secret routes and hidden corridors designed to maintain the seamless illusion of effortless grandeur. Servants moved through a parallel world of narrow hallways, back staircases, and service doors hidden in plain sight. They ensured that meals appeared instantly, fires were tended quietly, and the machinery of aristocratic life remained invisible. These carefully orchestrated paths mirrored the precision of the Victorian social hierarchy. The grandeur above was supported by the unseen labor below. Even the lesser rooms carried the same obsessive attention to detail. Galleries stretched along upper floors, hung with portraits that narrated the rise of the Carnarvon family. Each painting confronted visitors with a sense of lineage, a reminder that Highclere was not merely a home, but a monument to continuity. Smaller sitting rooms glowed with patterned wallpapers and handcrafted furnishings that turned every square foot into a curated scene. Guest rooms combined comfort with ceremony, offering luxurious fabrics and carefully arranged views that made the rolling parkland feel like an extension of the architecture. What made Highclere's interiors extraordinary was not simply their beauty, but their coherence. Every room, regardless of its purpose, felt connected to a grand vision, a vision grounded in heritage, elevated by Victorian taste, and executed with meticulous discipline. Together, the rooms formed a kind of living museum of 19th century craftsmanship. They reflected the precision of an architect who believed in harmony, the pride of a family eager to cement its place in society, and the atmosphere of an era convinced that beauty and structure could shape how people understood the world. Highclere became a lesson in luxury, not because it sought extravagance, but because it demanded harmony between past and present, between architecture and landscape, between public space and private life. The interior did more than impress visitors. It defined the character of the estate, revealing the minds and values of the people who shaped it. And for those who walked its halls in the years that followed, every carved panel and gilded surface served as a reminder that this house was built not only to be seen, but to be remembered. By the time Capability Brown set foot on the estate, Highclere had already begun its transformation from medieval relic to aristocratic powerhouse, but the land still lacked its defining voice. The house, both in its earlier form and the monumental one soon to rise under Barry, demanded a setting that could match its ambition. The rolling downs, ancient cedars, and scattered remnants of earlier gardens held potential, but they did not yet speak a unified language. What Brown brought to Highclere was not simply landscaping. He brought choreography. Lancelot, capability. Brown earned his nickname because he claimed every estate he visited had capability, hidden potential waiting to be revealed. At Highclere, he found a canvas unlike any other, a sweeping expanse of chalk hills, natural elevations, and wooded slopes that seemed almost pre-designed for the picturesque style he pioneered. Brown didn't see land as static. He saw movement, composition, and drama. And here, he imagined a landscape that would work with the house, not just surround it. The first step in his transformation was radical. He altered the placement of the surrounding village. The original settlement near the estate stood too close to the main house, cluttering the sweeping views he envisioned. So, the village was carefully relocated, an extraordinary measure that demonstrated just how seriously the family took his vision. With the village moved, the land around the future castle became a blank stage, ready for reinvention. Brown reshaped the hills themselves. Rather than impose rigid geometry or European formalism, he softened slopes, rounded edges, and carved subtle curves into the terrain. These refinements were nearly invisible as individual changes, but together they created an illusion of perfect natural harmony. Walkers could wander for hours without realizing that the hills they admired had been deliberately sculpted. He carved out long, flowing lawns that appeared to roll endlessly into the horizon, blurring the boundary between the estate and the countryside beyond. These lawns created uninterrupted sightlines that framed the house like a painting, a technique Brown had perfected at other grand estates, but executed with particular brilliance at Highclere. From every major window, the land seemed to stretch with effortless grace, as though nature itself had decided to flatter the architecture. Water became one of his most powerful tools. Brown understood that reflections could transform a view instantly, so he introduced serene lakes and reshaped existing streams into calm, controlled pathways. These bodies of water were designed not merely to please the eye, but to amplify the house's presence. On windless days, the surface mirrored the sky and doubled the scale of the estate. On foggy mornings, they added a layer of mystery, a soft veil that made Highclere appear as though it had emerged from another world. Groves of trees were arranged with mathematical precision, disguised as spontaneity. Brown selected placements that would frame the castle's silhouette from afar, interrupting views just enough to reveal the building gradually as visitors approached. This slow reveal was intentional, a theatrical device that heightened anticipation. As guests rode along the estate's paths, the house would appear, vanish behind trees, and reappear again in full brilliance. It was a performance scripted entirely through foliage and terrain. Clusters of woodland created depth, shadow, and contrast. Ancient beeches and oaks were preserved when possible, while new plantings extended their reach into areas lacking character. Brown understood color as deeply as painters did. The deep greens of cedar, the bright spring leaves of beech, the tawny autumn glow of oak all became brushes in his palette. These compositions ensured that Highclere's landscape changed personality with each season, creating a living artwork that evolved through the year. Perhaps most remarkable was the effect Brown created of complete naturalness. Visitors believed they were walking through untouched countryside, unaware that nearly every curve, line, and clearing had been meticulously shaped. The landscape felt effortless, and that was its genius. The architecture and land became inseparable, each elevating the other. The house would one day rise in Jacobean splendor, but its impact depended on the stage Brown had crafted decades earlier. By the time Barry began designing the new Highclere Castle in the 19th century, Brown's landscape was already doing exactly what it had been created to do, directing the eye, controlling the horizon, and framing the estate with a grandeur that felt inevitable. The castle did not dominate the land. It grew out of it, as though the hills themselves had insisted on supporting such a structure. Capability. Brown did not just plant trees or dig lakes, he shaped perception. He transformed Highclere into a vast outdoor theater, in which the house would become the central actor. And long before the first stone tower rose, the land was already telling the story, composed by a man who understood that nature, when guided with intention, could be the most powerful architectural element of all. By the mid-19th century, Highclere was no longer simply an architectural triumph or a masterpiece of landscape design. It had become something far rarer, a quiet engine of political influence, a place where ideas could be tested away from the noise of London, where conversations flowed more freely under soaring ceilings than in Parliament's crowded halls. And in that environment, in rooms built for spectacle yet shielded by privacy, the shape of a nation thousands of miles away began to take form. Highclere's role in Canadian history didn't begin with ceremony or fanfare. It began with visitors arriving discreetly, sometimes staying only a few days, sometimes weeks, leaving behind their names in the estate's guest book, but carrying away far more significant impressions. The fourth Earl of Carnarvon, deeply involved in British politics and admired for his careful intellect, turned the castle into an informal political salon. Leaders, diplomats, and thinkers found themselves seated in its drawing rooms, its library, or walking the wide lawns while discussing the future of the British Empire, particularly its territories in North America. What made these rooms so powerful was their atmosphere. In the saloon, where light filtered through stained glass and echoes rose to the ornate ceiling, conversations carried a seriousness that felt almost ceremonial. In the library, surrounded by thousands of books chronicling centuries of global history, debates took on a studious calm. Here, no voices needed to be raised. Ideas could settle, expand, and evolve in the quiet between sentences. Highclere provided both grandeur and isolation, a rare combination that encouraged clarity. It was in this environment, during the 1860s, that the fourth Earl began working with Canadian statesmen on what would become the British North America Act of 1867, the legal foundation for the creation of modern Canada. Figures like John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and Alexander Tilloch Galt walked through the same corridors visitors see today. Their minds focused not on the beauty around them, but on the enormous responsibility they carried. Their entries in the guest book remain physical traces of their presence, reminders that, before they became architects of a nation, they were guests in a house thousands of miles from the country they would help design. Discussions flowed from the library to the dining room, where long conversations stretched into late hours beneath glittering chandeliers. Over maps, documents, and drafts, the Earl and his Canadian counterparts debated federal structures, provincial rights, economic unity, and the delicate balance of preserving cultural identities within a single new entity. In these rooms, the theoretical began turning into the tangible. The walls of Highclere witnessed the early contours of a federation being drawn by men who understood the magnitude of their task and trusted this estate to give those ideas room to breathe. The Canadian delegates were struck not only by the estate's elegance, but by its sense of order. Highclere embodied the stability and continuity they wanted to incorporate into Canada's own political foundations. The calm, measured atmosphere influenced the tone of the discussions. Even disagreements took on a sense of discipline beneath ceilings carved with Gothic motifs and surrounded by portraits of English statesmen whose own successes and failures still whispered from the walls. By the time the final drafts were presented to Parliament in February 1867, much of the intellectual groundwork had already been laid in these rooms. Highclere had become an unofficial crucible for ideas that would ultimately define a nation. Its quiet played a role, its privacy played a role, its history played a role. The estate, which had absorbed centuries of English power, authority, and ambition, now lent that same weight to a new country taking shape across the Atlantic. In the decades that followed, the significance of Highclere's political chapter remained mostly unspoken outside scholarly circles. But in 2018, when the Canadian High Commissioner planted a maple tree on the estate lawn to honor the fourth Earl's contribution, it became clear that this grand house had been far more than a passive backdrop. It had been a partner, a witness, a silent architect. Walking through Highclere today, it's easy to be captivated by its beauty, the gilded ceilings, the stone tracery, the grand staircases. But for those who know its deeper history, the castle is far more than an elegant mansion. It is a place where a country was quietly shaped, where political futures were drafted in rooms built for contemplation and ambition. Highclere was not only the home of the Carnarvons. For a time, it became the birthplace of Canada. When the fifth Earl of Carnarvon inherited Highclere, the castle was already a monument of architecture, culture, and political history. But under his influence, it would gain an entirely new identity, one that reached far beyond England's borders and into the sands of ancient Egypt. What began as a personal fascination soon transformed Highclere into an unlikely epicenter of archaeological discovery, connecting the quiet Hampshire estate to mysteries buried for millennia. The Victorian world was gripped by a hunger for the past, but few could have predicted that one of the greatest archaeological partnerships in history would begin in these halls under the shadow of stone towers and carved ceilings. The fifth Earl, George Herbert, possessed an inquisitive mind and a restless spirit. His curiosity led him to Egypt at a time when exploration was both romantic and perilous, and where the line between scholarship and adventure blurred under the blazing desert sun. Illness had weakened him, but instead of retreating into the comfort of Highclere, he sought purpose and found it in Egyptology. The desert's heat, the ruins, the hieroglyphs, the silent tombs carved into stone cliffs at Thebes all stirred something in him that England's gentle hills could never match. It was during these early expeditions that Herbert met a man whose name would become inseparable from his own, Howard Carter. Carter was brilliant, obsessive, and resilient, a man who could read fragments of ancient inscriptions as fluently as maps. But he lacked funding, and his stubbornness often alienated patrons. The Earl recognized Carter's rare talent and offered him support when others hesitated. Their partnership began not out of convenience, but out of mutual respect, an aristocrat fascinated by the unknown, and an archaeologist hungry for the chance to prove himself. Their early work together focused on nobles' tombs in Deir el-Bahari, uncovering relics that made their way back to England, and eventually into Highclere itself. Soon, the castle's cellars were no longer just storage rooms. They became treasure vaults, housing artifacts thousands of years older than the estate's oldest stones. Visitors who stepped below ground found themselves transported from Victorian Britain into the world of pharaohs, painted carvings, fragments of statues, pottery, amulets, and even linen wrappings preserved across centuries. These collections would later form the foundations of Highclere's private Egyptian exhibition, turning the castle into an unexpected gateway between continents and eras. But the defining chapter of Highclere's Egyptian era began with an almost desperate search for a tomb that many believed had already vanished into legend, that of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. For years, Herbert funded Carter's excavations in the Valley of the Kings, enduring skepticism from the archaeological community and frustration from those who saw the project as a futile obsession. Season after season brought disappointment. Shafts filled with debris, fake leads, unfinished tombs, and endless fragments, but no burial chamber. Highclere's walls absorbed the emotional weight of each setback, as telegrams and letters carried news from the desert to the Earl's desk. Yet Carter refused to abandon the search, and in 1922, when most believed the valley had no secrets left, his persistence was rewarded. Beneath a pile of rubble overlooked by earlier expeditions, the team uncovered a sealed doorway. Behind it, untouched artifacts, golden shrines, chests, statues, and in the far chamber, the resting place of a forgotten king whose legacy would ignite the world's imagination. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb became a global sensation, a moment that redefined archaeology. And at the center of it stood the partnership that had begun within the walls of Highclere. The news electrified the estate. Rooms that had once hosted political debates and aristocratic gatherings now became the setting for urgent correspondence, planning, and research. The Earl traveled back and forth between Egypt and England, dividing his time between the castle's quiet halls and the chaotic energy of the excavation site. Highclere and the Valley of the Kings became twin centers of his life, one steeped in ancient stones, the other in Victorian splendor. Visitors sensed the tension between them, that the castle's gilded rooms were now connected to a discovery far more ancient and dazzling than anything inside its walls. Tragically, the Earl would not witness the full legacy of the discovery he had funded. Illness struck him in Cairo the following year. But Highclere, infused with his passion for Egypt, preserved his contributions. Lady Almina and later Lady Carnarvon continued to support Carter and protect the artifacts stored in the castle. The cellars became not a memorial, but a living museum, evidence of a partnership that changed the world history. Today, the Egyptian exhibition beneath Highclere is more than a collection. It is a testament to an extraordinary convergence: a Victorian castle in rural England, a visionary archaeologist, an adventurous aristocrat, and a pharaoh whose resting place had slept untouched for centuries. The drama of Tutankhamun's discovery echoes through the castle's corridors, adding a global dimension to its legacy. Highclere is not just a symbol of British heritage. It is a link between civilizations, stitched together through curiosity, ambition, and the relentless pursuit of knowledge. When the world was pulled into the chaos of the 20th century, Highclere, a place built for elegance, diplomacy, and intellectual discovery, found its purpose shifting in ways its architects could never have imagined. The grand corridors that once echoed with political debate and aristocratic conversation soon carried the sounds of boots, hurried footsteps, and the quiet resilience of those seeking safety. Under the crushing weight of global conflict, the castle's identity changed. Its rooms, carved with Victorian pride and filled with centuries of memory, became instruments of survival. During the First World War, Lady Almina, the 5th Countess of Carnarvon, transformed Highclere into a hospital for wounded soldiers. Her decision was not symbolic. It was a deliberate, exhaustive effort to turn luxury into relief. The saloon, once the centerpiece of aristocratic gatherings, became a triage area where stretchers replaced formal seating, and where the stained glass windows illuminated not gowns and jewels, but bandages, medical charts, and the weary faces of young men returning from the front. The upper floors, lined with portraits of ancestors, now housed rows of beds as the castle shifted from a social hub to a center of healing. Lady Almina herself worked tirelessly as a nurse, organizing supplies, tending to patients, and insisting that the wounded receive the highest standard of care. Her presence gave Highclere a new kind of dignity, not one forged by architecture or lineage, but by compassion. The castle, so often admired for its grandeur, now carried the weight of human suffering with quiet humility. It became a sanctuary where soldiers fought a different kind of battle, the struggle to recover. The Second World War brought a different kind of hardship. Britain braced for aerial attacks, and the countryside, though safer than cities, was not immune to danger. The wide lawns and open skies surrounding Highclere made it a silent witness to the war in the air. Allied aircraft patrolled overhead, and not all returned safely. Some crashed onto the estate's grounds, leaving behind fragments that the castle still preserves today. The roar of engines, the tremors of impact, and the discovery of wreckage added a haunting layer to the estate's history. The castle also sheltered evacuee children during the war, young boys and girls sent away from London to escape the bombings. For them, Highclere was at once strange and comforting, a labyrinth of hallways, hidden staircases, warm kitchens, and enormous rooms that stirred both awe and fear. They slept under ornate ceilings that had once been symbols of aristocratic pride, but now served a purpose far more vital. The children brought life into the castle even as the world outside grew darker, their laughter echoing through rooms that had recently held wounded soldiers and quiet sorrow. Though Highclere escaped the direct devastation that leveled parts of England, the war left its mark in quieter ways. Subtle structural strains, aging roofs burdened by neglect, and interiors that absorbed the exhaustion of years spent in service rather than celebration. The castle carried these scars with dignity, but they were unmistakable. The grand rooms that had hosted diplomats and aristocrats now bore the imprint of hospital equipment, wartime logistics, and the presence of countless individuals who had sought shelter within its walls. Even after peace returned, restoration proved difficult. Some damage could be repaired, cracks filled, roofs stabilized, rooms repainted, but not everything could be restored to its pre-war state. The castle's atmosphere had changed. Beneath the layers of carved wood and gilded frames, beneath the polished floors and restored draperies, lingered the memory of those who had relied on Highclere not for beauty, but for survival. No amount of restoration could erase that, nor should it. The wars transformed Highclere into more than a symbol of aristocratic luxury. They turned it into a participant in the nation's darkest hours, a place of refuge, resilience, and service. And while the castle eventually reclaimed its role as a home, and later as a cultural landmark, it carried forward the quiet gravity of those decades. Highclere became not only a masterpiece of architecture and landscape, but a witness to the human cost of history, a role that no restoration, however meticulous, could ever remove. By the end of the 20th century, Highclere stood at a crossroads more threatening than war, more corrosive than time itself. The castle that had survived centuries of political upheaval, the Reformation, the Victorian Reconstruction, 2 global conflicts, and the strain of serving as a hospital and refuge was now being undone by something quieter, slower, and far more relentless: decay. Stone may appear eternal, but even giants crumble when repairs are postponed year after year, and Highclere, for all its grandeur, was bleeding. The problems began at the top. Literally. The castle's vast roof, riddled with leaks and weakened tiles, had become a liability too large to ignore. Rainwater seeped through rafters, trickling into rooms that had once hosted royalty and heads of state. Plaster softened, wood warped, and ornate designs concealed under layers of paint began to disintegrate. Some rooms were closed entirely, left in darkness to keep visitors from seeing the scale of the damage. Behind the glamour of the public areas, Highclere was quietly collapsing. Maintenance costs ballooned into impossible numbers. By the early 2000s, estimates suggested more than £12 million were needed just to prevent irreversible deterioration. Urgent repairs alone required nearly £2 million, funds the family struggled to assemble. The Carnarvons lived not as lavish aristocrats, but as guardians of a building that demanded constant attention and expense. Heating systems groaned, windows rattled in their frames, and the servants' quarters, once bustling with life, had become ghostly reminders of a structure too large to sustain without modern means. The emotional toll was no less severe. Rooms once filled with laughter, study, conversation, and ceremony had gone silent, sealed behind locked doors to avoid embarrassment and danger. The castle's identity, a symbol of strength, culture, and continuity, had begun to feel fragile. For the Carnarvon family, this was not merely the decline of a house. It was the erosion of their heritage, their responsibility, their history. They could not allow Highclere to fade into a relic, admired from a distance but rotting from within, and so began the fight to save it. The 8th Earl of Carnarvon and Lady Carnarvon confronted the crisis with a combination of strategy, determination, and creative reinvention. They launched targeted restoration efforts, starting with the most urgent areas. The roof, battered by decades of weather, became the first battleground. Teams of craftsmen worked to stabilize beams, replace tiles, and protect the vulnerable interiors below. Every repair uncovered more problems: mold hidden behind paneling, cracked stone lintels, fragile wiring, aging plumbing. Each issue a reminder that the castle's survival depended on relentless effort. But financial reality demanded more than repairs. Highclere needed a way to sustain itself, to transition from private inheritance to a living, breathing enterprise. The solution arrived in the form of its own history, a story sleeping quietly in the cellars, the Egyptian exhibition. Drawing from the artifacts gathered during the 5th Earl's expeditions, the Carnarvons opened a museum beneath the castle, creating a link between the wonders of ancient Egypt and the halls of Highclere. Visitors could now walk through the same corridors that had once stored relics of Tutankhamun's world, turning history into revenue and preserving the house in the process. Exhibitions expanded, events were introduced. Highclere began hosting concerts, educational programs, and seasonal tours. Rooms once hidden from view were carefully restored and reopened, each one a victory against the looming threat of decay. The castle that had nearly become a burden was slowly regaining its dignity. But the true turning point arrived from an unexpected place: television. When the creators of Downton Abbey chose Highclere as the primary filming location for their series, the estate gained international fame almost overnight. Millions of viewers fell in love with its profile: the towers, the saloon, the sweeping drive, unaware that behind the scenes, the estate had been fighting for survival. The influx of visitors following the show changed everything. Tour revenue surged, restoration projects accelerated. The castle's story, once teetering between life and decline, entered a renaissance as engineers, artisans, and historians worked together to preserve its future. The Carnarvons embraced this momentum. They opened more of the house to the public, strengthened its role as a cultural landmark, and reinvested funds into stabilizing its most vulnerable structures. What had once been darkened rooms slowly returned to life. Cracked ceilings were repaired, faded wallpapers restored, and furniture long covered in dust returned to its former elegance. Highclere began to breathe again. Yet beneath the triumph lay the memory of how close the estate had come to slipping away. Every repaired stone, every polished banister, every restored ceiling carried the weight of the family's determination. Highclere's survival was not guaranteed by wealth or title. It was secured by perseverance, creativity, and a willingness to adapt. In the 21st century, the castle stands not just as an architectural masterpiece, but as a testament to the Carnarvon family's resolve. They refused to surrender the home entrusted to them by history. Through financial strain, emotional burden, and years of painstaking work, they proved that Highclere was more than a relic. It was a living legacy, one worth fighting for. By the time Highclere entered the 21st century, it had already lived several lives. As a medieval estate, an aristocratic seat, a center of political history, a hub of Egyptian discovery, a wartime refuge, and a house repeatedly pulled back from the edge of collapse. But nothing in its long lineage could have predicted what came next. A transformation driven not by architects, politicians, or explorers, but by cameras. The modern revival of Highclere did not begin with blueprints or restorations. It began with a script. When the creators of Downton Abbey first approached the Carnarvons with the idea of filming a period drama within the castle, the estate was still recovering from years of costly repairs. Towers had been strengthened, but remained fragile. Some rooms were immaculate, while others were sealed, quietly waiting for restoration. Yet, Highclere had something no studio set could ever replicate: authenticity. Its saloon, with its towering arches and carved balconies, carried the weight of actual history rather than constructed illusion. Its drawing rooms, libraries, and hallways were not recreations. They were lived spaces, polished by centuries of footsteps. When the filmmakers walked through, they knew immediately. They had found their world. The first episodes aired in 2010, and what followed was nothing short of extraordinary. Highclere, already significant within Britain, became instantly recognized around the globe. Its profile, those unmistakable towers rising above green lawns, became a symbol of aristocratic England in the imagination of millions. Audiences were captivated by its charm, its scale, and its quiet authority. The castle now belonged not only to history, but to contemporary culture. Visitors arrived in waves unlike anything the estate had seen before. Tourists from across Europe, America, Asia, and beyond traveled to stand in the same rooms they had seen on screen. They wandered the grounds, gazed at the cedar trees, and marveled at the saloon where actors had whispered secrets and delivered lines that traveled the world. The castle's newfound fame solved a problem that had haunted the Carnarvons for decades: funding. Ticket sales poured into restoration efforts, allowing long-closed rooms to be repaired and reopened, one by one. Battlements were reinforced. Roofs were rebuilt section by section. Delicate plasterwork, nearly lost to damp and time, was skillfully restored. Artisan teams returned the castle's faded colors to life, restaining wood, cleaning fabrics, and preserving tapestries that had survived generations. Interiors once hidden behind locked doors slowly emerged from darkness, reclaiming their place in the estate's story. Even the towers, which had endured harsh winds and structural fatigue, were saved from a slow decline thanks to the influx of resources and global attention. But Highclere's renaissance was not limited to physical repairs. The castle regained its cultural voice. Exhibitions expanded, including the beloved Egyptian gallery that continues to draw visitors fascinated by the fifth Earl's partnership with Howard Carter. Seasonal celebrations now fill the estate, Christmas fairs glowing with lights, summer concerts echoing across the parkland, and educational events that bring new generations into contact with the living past. The Carnarvons themselves adapted gracefully to Highclere's evolving role. They share the castle with the world, while still preserving its identity as a family home. They balance public access with private life, moving to a cottage on the estate during peak tourist seasons, but returning to the castle when the crowds fall away. It is a modern coexistence, practicality intertwined with tradition. Highclere today is no static museum. It breathes, it changes, it hosts gardeners tending Capability Brown's landscapes, researchers studying its archives, filmmakers capturing new stories, and visitors discovering its old ones. It stands as a testament to resilience, a house that endured financial strain, natural decay, global conflict, and centuries of transformation, only to rise again through the power of storytelling. Millions now know Highclere not only for what it once was, but for what it has become, a symbol of Britain's layered history, a monument reborn by imagination, and a reminder that even the grandest structures must adapt to survive. Through the lens of Downton Abbey, the world fell in love with Highclere's silhouette. Through the dedication of the Carnarvon family, that silhouette remains whole, and so, the castle stands, not as a relic of a fading era, but as a living legend, carrying its past with pride, while welcoming each new chapter with open doors and upward-reaching towers.